All right, everybody, thank you for coming to the regular meeting of the Reno City Planning Commission, Wednesday, April 3rd, 6 p.m. Item 1, Pledge of Allegiance. I will kick it off. Let's do it. I pledge allegiance to the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, liberty and justice for all. All right, item 2, roll call. Heather, please.
Harris Armstrong.
Here.
Manny Becerra.
Here.
Arthur Munoz.
Here.
Carrie Romeyer is absent at this time. Alex Velto, absent at this time. Sylvia Villanueva.
Here.
JD Draculich.
Here.
All right, we have a quorum.
Thank you. All right, item 3, public comment. This item is for either public comment on any action item or for any general public comment. Heather, any requests to speak forms, Zooms, voicemails?
Members of the public may call into the meeting to provide public comment by using the Zoom link provided on the agenda, specifically https://links.reno.gov/planning04-03-24. It should be noted for those in the audience that comments are to be addressed to the Planning Commission as a whole. Comments heard under this item will be limited to 3 minutes per person and may pertain to matters both on and off the Planning Commission agenda. Please note that the Planning Commission may not take action upon any matter not agendized for possible action on today's agenda. When you are called on for public comment, please state your name for the record and begin speaking. The timer will begin when you say your name, and you will be afforded 3 minutes. If you are an attendee in the Zoom meeting and would like to make public comment at this time, please raise your hand. Lastly, while in this room, please be respectful. Warnings will be issued by the presiding officer if there is disruptive behavior, and you will be asked to leave chambers if the behavior continues. We did receive public comment that was general in nature and not specific to any items on the agenda. These were forwarded to the Planning Commission and have been entered into the record. I do not have any requests to speak forms for this item.
Great, thank you. Anybody in the chambers wish to speak on general public comment? Seeing none, we will close item number 3, move to item number 4, approval of minutes, item for 4.1, Reno City Planning Commission regular meeting of March 6th.
Commissioner Monis, I move to approve minutes.
All right, we have a motion.
Motion. Second.
Yeah.
I was expecting a visual, but I didn't see. Second.
Okay, got a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none. Minutes approved. Moving on to item number 5, zoning code cleanup. Item 5.1, staff report, case number TXT 23-00005, Title 18, zoning code cleanup.
Good afternoon. For the record, Angela Foose, Assistant Director with Development Services. So this is meeting number 2 in a series of meetings we're having with the Planning Commission to go over the proposed zoning code cleanup. Just to make sure everyone understands what this zoning code cleanup is, I wanted to highlight what this is and what this is not. Again, this is intended to be a cleanup. These are things that over the last 3 years of having an adopted new code, we've been keeping a list of areas that maybe are inconsistent with each other or are difficult to administer because we as staff don't understand it or can't figure out how to interpret it. We also looked at things that maybe don't match what some of the new legislative session requirements are. So we're making sure that we're updating our code to match those requirements. And then bigger picture, we're looking at what can we do to protect residential neighborhoods. This is something that our city council has made a priority. And so as part of this cleanup, we are keeping that in the back of our mind of, yes, we want to continue allowing development and infill and higher density in these areas that match, again, what regional planning says is where we want development to happen. But we want to do it in a way that protects existing neighborhoods. So just in terms of process and timeline, This zoning code cleanup has been going on for quite some time. We started with holding meetings with our technical advisory committee. This was made up of people that actually use the zoning code. So this was architects, engineers, planners, landscape architects. We had a group of about 30 individuals. Basically, if you've never read a zoning code, you were not a technical advisor. if you've read our zoning code and used our zoning code and understand kind of the intricacies of it, we put together a list of those individuals. So we had about 7 meetings with that group, and we went page by page with these red lines. Once we did that, we held 9 stakeholder meetings. So we included anyone from the public that wanted to participate. We held meetings in person, we held meetings online, we held meetings at 9 a.m., we held meetings at noon, and we held meetings in the evening. So if you were working and you wanted to participate, we gave you time. If you wanted to do it during the daytime, we gave you more time. So again, we tried to open it up to the public as much as we could. Again, those 9 meetings were composed of both virtual and in person. We held them in North Valleys, in downtown, and in South Valleys. Again, trying to just be as open and broad and transparent as we could. So 9 meetings with the general public. Very little turnout. I think part of the reason for the little turnout, this is a very technical update. There's not a lot of substance that most people can relate to because it doesn't really impact them. You know, when we talked about accessory dwelling units, we get a lot of interest. When we talk about affordable housing, that's something that people understand. But when we say words like setbacks and building height, most people don't care. Most people say, it sounds technical, that sounds great. So where we're at now, we are holding meetings with the Planning Commission. Again, the incentive here is that this is open to the public. There's not a lot of public here today, but the public has the ability to watch, hopefully online, and if they fall asleep, they can go back and watch again when they wake up. This is something that we didn't do in 1 meeting, we're doing over the course of 3 meetings. Now, you guys are not making any formal recommendations during these 3 meetings. This is just input. So what you say today is just input. This is not the letter of the law. You're not adopting or recommending anything in these 3 meetings, just getting feedback. We're going to take your feedback and we're going to go to City Council and just let them know what your feedback was. Then they're going to provide feedback on your feedback. And we're going to come back to Planning Commission and talk about that feedback. And we're going to have another meeting just talking about that. Again, you're not formally recommending anything, we're just talking. It's a lot of talking, trying to be transparent. After that, you're going to give me more input on what you like or don't like about council's feedback. And then I'm going to come back again, and I'm going to have a formal, actual document that you can review and make recommendations on. So again, many steps in this project, this process that the public can be a part of and that you guys are also a part of. No formal recommendations for many, many meetings, at which time then hopefully we'll get to a place where you're ready to make a recommendation. Your recommendation then goes to council. They can agree or not agree. We'll have multiple meetings with council where they're going to review those edits, those changes, that feedback. Ultimately, hopefully at some point in the next 6 months, we'll have a document that they can support and recommend approval on. Any questions just generally on the process? Anyone uncomfortable with the process?
Please.
I think I understand it, and actually it's really thorough, and I appreciate that. But just so I feel like I'm contributing in a meaningful way, Angela, what type of feedback would you feel is most helpful this evening?
If there's something that, excuse me, you don't agree with, that feedback would be helpful. For instance, at the last discussion we had, there was questions about tattoo shops and why we don't allow tattoo shops in downtown. So that was good feedback for us as staff to say, good question. If that's something you guys would like to see us do, we'll take that feedback and present that to council. Again, if they want to see tattoo shops in downtown, we can incorporate that into the code.
Perfect. And would you like to kind of volley along the way, like just back and forth as you're kind of going through the changes, or
I
at
do
the
think,
end?
yeah, we have about 18 slides similar to our last meeting. So it kind of helps while we're on that slide. If there's something that you have questions on or want to discuss, bring it up at that point.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so this is basically one giant chapter with a lot of information. So we're going to go article by article within just this one big chapter, and it covers everything related to hillsides, residential adjacency, parking standards, hillside development standards. So again, a lot of this is going to be very high level. You guys do have the red line document, so I do hope that you are looking at it. The red line document is annotated, so you can understand why we're proposing these changes. We also have a staff report that highlights all of these changes if you don't want to read all 650 pages and you just want the short version summarized in a staff report. All right, so within our natural resource protection, we really didn't have a whole lot of edits. We had some updates, more clarification related to some FEMA requirements. This is something we'd worked with our engineering team. It wasn't anything of substance. It was more just clarifying how we measure some of these FEMA areas and how we measure floodplain areas. Again, not a whole lot of substance, just more providing better clarification. Tree protection. So this is something that, as a city, we've been looking at for a couple years now. At one point, we had talked about a separate tree ordinance. That has kind of been stalled while we're working on implementing some other things. So we went back and we looked at what was proposed in the tree protection ordinance, and we took out things that weren't controversial. These are things that better provide clarification. Anytime you have a construction site, we have requirements that you have to protect trees. So this outlines which trees you have to protect and where on your site. So as an example, let's say you have a big industrial site. You're going to come in, you're going to just mass grade the whole site. Which trees do you protect? From a city perspective, we can only have so much control over a certain number of trees. Anything in the public right-of-way are considered our trees, city-owned trees, which is more of an asset for us. So those are the trees you definitely have to protect. Anything within your front setback, meaning the difference between the front property line and your building setback, is also in an area that we want to protect. So we've basically just provide clarification that outlines that. We've gotten a lot of questions from the public. Does this mean that I can't cut down a tree in my backyard? No. Anything on a single family or a duplex property, we don't have any control of. This doesn't change that. Any kind of property, again, trees on private property, the city doesn't have control over, but if it's within a front setback area, we do want to see it and we want to show what you're doing to protect it. You can still cut it down. Again, it's your right to do that. We do have requirements that outline if there's penalties, because again, we'd like to see older trees preserved. You get credit for preserving certain number of trees. Again, the size of the tree goes into it, the type of tree goes into it. So this just clarifies all that information, not creating any new requirements, but clarifying which trees have to be protected. Questions on tree protection? This is kind of a hot topic, or has been for a couple years, so I just want to make sure I'm not talking over anything.
Angela, yeah, and just to that point, I think you covered what I've heard before in the long past in the neighborhood I live in. We see trees in the, like you said, the setback from the property line, being able to be cut down because they're dead or whatever, and someone gets upset because they feel like it's their tree, why is the city cutting it down? But thanks for the clarification there, and I think people knowing that this isn't changing anything on their private property.
Correct.
I'm glad you stated. Thank
Correct. Okay, fair. Huh?
Oh, please, Commissioner
So
Villanueva.
I think for me, I'm going to wait till you get through all the slides, and then probably the next meeting I will have, because I'd rather you go through everything than me go in and review kind of what you discussed and see where that matches up. And then the next meeting, I'll probably have questions or feedback, but is that appropriate?
I think that would be fine. Next meeting, we're going to go through the next section of chapters.
Oh, okay.
So if however you want to do it, I will say at the next meeting, we can do kind of an overview of everything. So if there's anything we've missed big picture, I'll put all of the slides into one presentation over these 3 meetings so that we can go back to any slides and answer any questions overall.
Okay, that would be great, just because it's hard for me to kind of see what your guys' position is and then compare it to actually what's in the red line versus how, okay,
Yep.
Great, thank you.
Okay, feral horse management. So prior to our code adoption that was done 3 years ago, we didn't have any regulations on wild horses. And with our last code adoption, we adopted a handful of new standards related to feral horses. This only applies if you're doing development in Southeast Reno. We have a kind of the Virginia Range, as it's called. We don't have a whole lot of development over there. That's more of in the Tamani High School area where the wild horses kind of live and range. So in working with the wild horse advocates, they asked us to add a couple additional standards. From a staff perspective, these seem to make sense. We've had a couple projects in the past couple years where it made sense. It didn't feel like this was negatively impacting development. It did feel like it was something, it was more of a working with the horse advocates rather than kind of, being against each other. So we felt that this was something that made sense. Bigger picture, it was more of clarification. So right now, we don't really define what the Virginia range is or where this applies, so we just added some geographic boundaries of what's considered Virginia range. Some of the challenges we've seen with new development is, for the most part, the wild horses are intended to, stay in the wild range. When they do cross over, they make it either through gates that have been cut down or cut open. Some of the challenges we have is that the general public, doesn't necessarily understand of the need to keep them on their side and not to feed them. When we feed them, it just encourages them to come into the areas where we have development, and again, that creates the conflict. So again, in working with the wild horse advocates, they proposed that we add some additional fencing standards, and that we also add some requirements for signage on that fencing, and basically just trying to let people know, please don't feed the horses, and keep the gates closed when you come in and out. So again, we didn't feel any of these were too major. It was more just things that we're asking developments to do anyway when they have construction in this area, so it made sense. Questions on this one?
Sure. I have one, Angela. We recently had this as a kind of a related topic, I think 2 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago. Do you feel these changes help address or kind of satisfy the concerns of the horse advocates?
Yeah, and again, and this specifically came from the horse advocate group. So this was the language that they gave us, not my bulleted point, but the stuff that's actually in the red line is the language they gave us. We copied and pasted that into code, so I feel that we have met
That's awesome.
that need.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Okay. Again, this is more of a technical issue. When we are dealing with grading plans, we had to kind of clarify that when you're dealing with major site plan review for grading like cuts and fills, you guys see these a lot come before you, grading over 20, cuts and fills over 20 feet and 10 feet. So we had to add some clarifying language of when cuts and fills is triggered and what the actual application is. Some of our code said a conditional use permit is required. Other sections of our code said a major site plan review is required. Those were conflicting. We wanted to make sure we had one set of regulations, so we just clarified if you do trigger those things, a major site plan review is required. And then we do require a re-vegging. Basically, if you're going to do a bunch of grading on a site, we ask that you hydroseed. So we have some regulations on those requirements. Again, just added some more flexibility of what that looks like. Not all re-veg is kind of reviewed the same depending on where you're at in town. Sometimes you have different landscape or re-veg needs. So we just added more flexibility so that we could address different parts of town and kind of just different needs depending on what the soil looks like. Yeah.
Please, go ahead.
So can you describe, just quickly highlight for me some of the details of a major site plan review?
What's required?
Yeah.
Yep, so major site plan review is an application we accept twice a month, typically depending on what you're submitting for. Sometimes you submit a plan that includes a utility plan, a grading plan. If there's buildings involved, you would submit architectural drawings. Staff reviews it, writes a staff report. 2.5 months later, that shows up at Planning Commission.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so we have a whole section of our code that deals with development, dealing with hillsides. And essentially, if you are developing on a slope, a hillside, we have requirements that require so much open space. And so you basically do some math, you show us how much is within different slope percentages, right? The more steep the site, the more open space is required. So we added some language here because there was some confusion. Can you use the density bonus if you're dealing with hillside development? Density bonus is basically allowed in our code. You're allowed to do it in residential development. You get additional density or more units depending on the size of the unit. So we'd had a couple projects that had come through. They said, well, can we use density bonus if we're on a hillside development? And our code was really unclear. So we just clarified that, yes, you can use that density bonus if you're on a hillside. I think we've had maybe one project in 3 years that came forward that was a hillside development that requested to use that density bonus. We did allow them to. They went through a tentative map, I believe. So again, this is just more clarifying something that we're at least allowed one time in practice. All right, streets, utilities, and services. Again, this is more of a technical section of our code. We have a lot of requirements related to sidewalks and streets, meaning where sidewalks required, how wide do they have to be, when do you have to put in parkway strips. A lot of our requirements conflicted with other sections of the city requirements. So zoning regulates just the zoning piece. Our Public Works Design Manual regulates anything on city property. And so they had their own set of requirements of how wide sidewalks have to be and how wide streets have to be. Our zoning code conflicts with a lot of the sections of the Public Works Design Manual, so the ones related to sidewalks we're cleaning up now as part of this code update. Separately, probably in the next year, we're going to come back to you with a bunch of changes specifically related to the Public Works Design Manual. They are also going through an update, so as they update their requirements, again, on how wide streets are, where bike lanes are going to be required, when sidewalks are required to be 4 feet versus 6 feet, we'll come back and update our zoning code so that we match the Public Works Design Manual. Again, but short term, we just wanted to make sure that some of those quick things that we see on a regular basis are being updated to match what they currently have in their code. Sidewalk waivers or something, we have regulations on where sidewalks are required. We do get a lot of questions of, well, do I have to put in sidewalks? What if I'm in an area that has a sidewalk that would lead to nowhere? Do I still have to do it? So we have a waiver program that's just done administratively where we can allow you to not have to put in sidewalks in certain situations. So we cleaned up some of that language to make it a little bit more understandable about when you can get a waiver and when you cannot. And then next, related to undergrounding power lines, we have regulations. Sometimes you're required to underground the power line that's in front of your property, sometimes you're not. There's a lot of things that go into it. How big is the power line? If it's one of those giant power lines, we don't underground those. Nobody undergrounds those. But these smaller ones, like the 25 kV, we typically require that you underground them. We found that we had some standards that weren't consistent with the regional plan. The Truckee Meadows regional plan actually requires a 10-foot setbacks for certain really big power lines, like the one in the picture there. And so we wanted to make sure that our zoning code matched the regional utility corridor, which is referenced in the regional plan. So more of a clarification, making sure that our codes are matching the Public Works Design Manual and the Truckee Meadows regional plan. Questions on any of that?
Sure. Would the underground power lines only be applicable for new development or existing if you were?
So we don't actively go out and tell people to underground the power line in front of their business or home. Mm-hmm. But when you come in for development, we look at if there's a power line literally on your property. Mm-hmm. Again, if you meet certain thresholds, then we require that you underground it.
Okay, perfect. And then what would be an example of when someone could get away, if you will, with no sidewalk?
So, I would say more recently, we had a situation where, as an example, a church that came through for just a 30-day review, something staff reviewed. The church was there and didn't have sidewalks on one side. And you think, well, why wouldn't they have sidewalks on one side? The area was developed probably 10, 15 years ago. And it led to a development that was a county development at the time, and the county generally doesn't have sidewalks. Mm-hmm. So we have that in a lot of areas of town where Reno and the county kind of conflict or, sure, are next to each other. Yeah. So in certain areas where we'd say, well, you're basically building a sidewalk that leads to nothing, and there's not sidewalks on either side of the street, we would work with you if you asked for a waiver to say you could move forward with not having to put in a sidewalk.
Okay, That makes sense. I guess I was coming at it from the lens of accessibility and all that. And I can think of like Clearacre and Montello, where the city and county kind of meet there, as an example.
Yep, and everything's case by case. I mean,
Okay.
there's not like a one-size-fits-all, which is why we have that waiver program. It gives us the ability to look at it, especially in these older neighborhoods. We even have some over by Reno High School, where they were built, 50 years ago when they didn't have sidewalks on all the streets. So as a new development comes in, like a house, because it's surrounded by houses, and they may say, hey, I don't have sidewalks on either side of my street or either side of my house. Why am I required to put in a sidewalk where there's no sidewalks anywhere else on my street? We look at that on a case-by-case basis and say, you're right, why would we have a sidewalk in front of one house and nowhere else on that street?
Okay, thank you, Angela.
Quick question, Chair.
Please.
Who's responsible for so after the sidewalks are put in, who maintains like the sidewalk?
If it's a city street, then the city of Reno maintains the sidewalk.
Okay, so even though it's obligated to be put in by the development, whoever's developing the property, it is ultimately maintained by the city?
Unless it's on, again, there's so many one-offs, but generally
Okay.
speaking, city streets are owned by the city, and the sidewalk would also be in our right-of-way. We have private streets, which the city does not maintain, so a private street we wouldn't maintain, nor a private sidewalk.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay. So this was another area of our code dealing with driveways, and anytime we're looking at traffic reports. So when new development comes in, we look at what the use is, and we oftentimes trigger a traffic report, like a traffic study. One thing that we are now requesting is information on what are you doing in terms of bike lanes, sidewalks. As part of your traffic study, you think normally you're just dealing with cars. But as a city, we're really trying to look at more of the multimodal type of transportation. So we added some language to say when you come in with your traffic study, not only are we looking at how cars are getting in and out of your site, but how you're addressing the bike lanes. And again, sometimes it's a 4-foot wide sidewalk, sometimes it's a 10-foot wide sidewalk. So we want you to show that as part of your traffic study. And then related to driveway requirements, this is something you guys hardly ever see, but when a development comes in, we look at like a residential development. We have requirements of how wide driveways have to be. If it's a single-family home, we have a certain requirement. If it's just a driveway to get into and out of like an apartment project, it's a different requirement. A lot of our driveway requirements conflicted with the Public Works Design Manual. Again, just two documents that are, were drafted at different times over the years. And so we said, ooh, let's clean up our driveway spacing requirements to match the Public Works Design Manual. Not a lot of substance to that. Again, more of just making sure that our regulations match the Public Works Design Manual regulations. Off-street parking. So this is a whole section of our code. Anytime you have new development, you have a use, and let's just make one up. Let's just say you're at a Target shopping center. So you would look at the parking section and figure out, well, how many parking spaces am I required to have? And how many ADA or handicap parking spaces am I required to have? And it's all math. It's based on your use and the square footage of your building. We found that our handicap parking requirements were different than the building code. So when somebody came in with a development at a building permit stage, our planners and engineers were looking at the zoning code saying, oh, our code says you need 20 parking spaces. And that means you need 3 handicap parking spaces. And then our building folks who review the building permit were like, oh, well, we review the building code, and that requires not 3 handicap parking spaces, but maybe 5. So we had 2 conflicting sets of regulations. ADA is more of a federal regulation, so it's not something the zoning code should vary from, national standards on. So we said, well, that's an easy cleanup. So we just changed our ADA parking to match building code, which again, matches federal regulations. And then in terms of anytime we have a change of use, one of the challenges we're finding is while we want to encourage a change of use, we want to encourage new development to come in, especially in these areas like our downtown where maybe you had a business that came in 40 years ago. And so over the past 40 years, the codes and the rules have changed. And so maybe you can't meet the parking requirements because your site was not designed with a parking lot big enough to meet today's parking requirements. That didn't seem to make sense. I felt like we were pushing away development in these areas that were really just kind of a reuse, which we want to encourage these reuses. So we added more flexibility to say, hey, we will allow you to come in with less parking if you do a parking study to show that this will work. And so we have some rules that say using kind of national best practices, prove to us that whatever your use is and the number of parking spaces you're proposing still meets national standards, and we'll work with you on that. So again, just adding more clarification, trying to get some of these older, outdated sites to come in with some of these adaptive reuses. Questions on that? Okay, and again, still dealing with parking. We have some pretty specific bike parking requirements, and we found that we're just getting a lot of complaints on our kind of over-the-top bike parking regulations. We have regulations that you have to have a certain square footage for every bike parking space, and they have to be covered, and it just became kind of problematic. Again, we got a lot of complaints over the years on our bike parking, so we said the intent still is to have bike parking on every site. And so any new use that comes in is still required to have bike parking, but we're just providing a lot more flexibility. As an example, some of the things we looked at, the Moana pool. So the Moana pool came in recently, and they came in through a building permit, and I think they were supposed to have 60 parking spaces or some ridiculous amount. I can't think of any situation where they would need 60 bike parking spaces. So we said, well, that's just dumb. So for every, all that square footage that they were using on bike parking, it took away from actual car parking. So again, sometimes it just doesn't make sense. I think if it was an area where, like a school needs more bike parking because the kids are biking to school. But in an area where we know we generally don't have a need for 60 bike parking spaces, we said, let's provide a little bit more flexibility. So we added a little bit more language that we can work with you, whatever your use is, whether it's, again, a community center, an apartment complex, or just a shopping center, you still have to provide bike parking. We have minimum requirements, but we have more flexibility on a case by case. If you can show that your use maybe needs more or less, we can work with you on that. Compact parking. So this is just, again, regular parking. We currently allow a certain percentage of your site to use compact parking. On average, your average parking stall is 9 feet wide by 19 feet long. So compact parking, you can go more narrow and less deep. So we currently allow you to have up to 15% of your overall site to be used as compact. So if you have a big Target shopping center, let's say you have to have 100 just regular car parking spaces, 15% would be 15 of those out of 100 could be compact. And we found that wasn't really doing a whole lot. We got a lot of pushback from the development community of, hey, can I have more compact? And so we upped that from 15% to 25%. So again, if you had 100 spaces that were required, now you could have to have 25% can be compact instead, so 25% or 25 in this example versus 15. So a little bit more flexibility. That's also something we were hearing from the developers that do a lot of infill is, hey, the more you can do to help us do infill, compact really helps, the better off we are. So we did that. We have some regulations that we actually penalize you if you provide more parking than the code requires. And that seems silly, right? Why are we penalizing people if they want to put in more parking than is required? We penalize them by saying you have to add more landscaping than code requires if you have more parking than is required. So as an example, let's say you're required to have 100 spaces and you want to put in 130 spaces. We penalize you by saying now you have to add even more landscaping. If you have a use, let's say you're doing a call center and you know you have a lot of employees that need to be there and maybe you need all 130 parking spaces. Great, we want to encourage you to do development and do something that works for you. So rather than penalizing you, we're just saying, great, if you want to add more parking, put in more parking, we're fine with that. And then we had another,
So with that, I thought the intent or policy reason for that was to avoid large blacktop spaces without any canopy. So for example, the parking lot across the street from the Atlantis where I don't know what's there now. I think it used to be a Goodwill or Sky Pro or something like that, or Ski Pro. There's no shrubbery, there's no trees or anything. It's just blacktop. Tons of parking, but really no greenery. So that's an example of why I thought there was a policy. It's not really punitive. It's more, it's not necessarily there to act as a penalty for them having more parking. I thought there was an actual policy reason for it. So can you go into detail?
So we still require trees and shrubs based on the number of parking spaces you have. So that hasn't changed. I think it's for every 10 parking spaces, you have to have a tree. For every tree, you have to have 6 shrubs. That hasn't changed. So you still have to provide all those trees based on the number of parking spaces you are providing. So you still get that canopy, that tree canopy, just based on standard code requirements.
Okay, so if they had the extra 30, they'd have to accommodate that with the extra tree to go in there, so we're still avoiding that whole...
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So when you touched briefly on it, you said something like we were penalizing them. Penalizing them how specifically? I mean, not tied to the additional tree, but how so?
We required not just that landscaping, so that's standard code, but we require above and beyond additional landscaping. So not only do you have to provide, again, that standard, 1 tree for every 10 spaces, it was an additional amount of landscaping. So basically, it's kind of like this catch-all of like, we want you to provide more landscaping, which means you have to take away parking, which seems kind of in conflict with what you're trying to do. If you have a use and you want more parking because your customers maybe need it or your employees need it, then put in more parking. What we don't want to do is discourage parking. And I think policy-wise, back in the day, we were trying to encourage people to use more transit and not use cars. So this was one way to encourage developers to not put in more parking than needed. But again, what we have found is that if a use and a tenant needs more parking, why are we telling them no? Right? That means they have to put in less building because they now have to put in more landscaping. Rather than saying, put in more landscaping above and beyond what code already requires, put in enough parking to meet your needs, whether it's your client needs or your employee needs. We want you to make it a use that makes sense.
Okay. I mean, I'd like to hear more feedback on that from others. Not necessarily here, but just, I mean, I guess you didn't really get a lot of public input, huh?
No.
So, okay, that's just something for notes. Maybe you can bring that to others and see what others say.
And I think from the technical advisory committee comments, he said, great. We hate the fact that, for some reason, city code feels that they are the experts on how many parking spaces we need. But again, we have a very generic parking requirement that's based on, commercial. What if your commercial need is something specific? It's not just a generic commercial. Again, call center is a great example. Like we can assume we know what you need for parking, but if you're telling us you have more employees and so you need more parking, why is zoning dictating how many parking spaces you need? And so I think from the technical advisory committee comments, they thought that made more sense and allowed for more flexibility with the developers to basically accommodate their parking needs based on what they think they need.
So on the one end, I know the city wants to have minimum parking. We want to have that floor set. But when it comes to additional, I guess there's a rub a little bit with regard to some of our positions that we've talked about on the Planning Commission regarding, less parking, more transit, more walkability, more alternate forms of transportation. So again, I present that, see what others say. I'm not a developer. I don't really know. It just seems like it's counter to what we've kind of been saying over the last few years. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the general public feels that we should have more parking everywhere, right? Take Midtown. The biggest complaint about Midtown is you should put in more parking. So this kind of aligns with a lot of complaints we're getting from the community about why don't we require more parking?
And I think it's funny because they say that, but then it takes away from why people appreciate Midtown and what it is and the character of Midtown.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
No, it's definitely a conflict. But again, if the direction from Planning Commission is your preference is to not do that, then we can definitely move that forward. All right, and then final thing on this one is we just had some requirements. When you have a parking lot, we have construction material, meaning you have to pave it. That was in our old code, but did not get added to the new code. So basically, we didn't have any specific requirements that required you to pave your parking lot. Of course, we want you to pave your parking lot. That was an oops, so we just copied and pasted what was in the old code and put it back in the new code. All right, on landscaping, we have quite a lot to talk about in terms of landscaping and screening and fencing. Big picture, we had some conflicting regulations. We have whole sections dealing with landscape requirements. Again, depending on what your zoning district is, we have a certain minimum percentage of site landscaping. And then we also had screening requirements. So if you have two different uses, let's say you have a shopping center next to a multifamily development, we have additional landscaping and screening requirements. And so some of those were conflicting, so it made it difficult to administer because you had two different sets of regulations. So we tried to clean that up as best we could and have more of one set of standards. We had some weird standards. I think this was a carryover from probably the last 20 years related to parking structures. I will say this one's kind of funny to me because Reno really doesn't get a lot of new parking structures. I mean, in your time on Planning Commission, how many new parking structures have you reviewed? Probably zero. Reno's not known for having a lot of parking structures. So we took out anything specifically on landscaping requirements specific to parking structures. We said that's a building, you should landscape it the same that you landscape all buildings. Again, it was kind of what we call like a hidden Easter egg. Like, why would you even find that? Why would you look for a separate landscaping standard specific to parking structures when we really hardly ever get new ones? And then in dealing with Tamwa, one of the challenges we're having in a lot of our parkway strips is you have these beautiful parkway strips. South Meadows is a great example, where you have trees and turf in these parkway strips, which means you have to have irrigation. And so if there's turf, that means you have to have spray irrigation. Reno tends to be very windy in the summer and the afternoons, and we're finding that we're having a lot of that spray run off into the streets, and it's degrading our streets. So it's costing the city a lot in terms of pavement maintenance. So we work with Tamwa and we said, how do you guys feel about this? And they said, yeah, we don't like turf in the landscape strip either. A lot of that water is wasted. That spray irrigation gets wasted. It's such a narrow strip. And so in working with them, we came up with a new requirement that if you have turf within 18 inches or 1.5 feet of the right-of-way, you can't have turf within that window. So you have to, again, we're not going back and penalizing anyone that's done it, but moving forward, we don't want to see turf within 18 inches of the right-of-way because we don't want that spray irrigation. Any questions on any of that? Okay. This is more specific to our screening. So the way our code currently works is we have a table related to landscape screening, and it's currently based on your use and your zoning district. And we found that a lot of times the zoning district didn't match what the use was. So for instance, if you're in a mixed use zoning district, that could be anything from an apartment to industrial to commercial. So how do you screen based on such a broad, zoning district? So we changed that and we said, let's look at use next to use and have screening requirements. This is everything from, again, best example is a Target next to an apartment complex. We do require that you have certain types of fencing, usually it has to be 6 foot tall, and we require trees spaced every so many feet. For every tree you have, you're also required to have 6 shrubs. So we added this, we went back and we really looked at, again, the intent is to protect residential development from some of these non-residential uses. So we went back and we said, let's clean up that table and try and provide more screening, improved screening, I would say. So again, we have different types of fencing. You could have, fencing that is like split rail so you can see through it. It doesn't really do a lot to screen. So in that case, we have a wider setback where you have to have setback between the building and setback between the fence. And then we also have tree requirements and shrub requirements. So we went back and we looked at all that. This is when I will say we worked quite heavily with our Technical Advisory Committee and the landscape architect community, and we said, what's an appropriate spacing for trees? If you plant trees too close together, it really inhibits their ability to grow because they can't get the sunlight to them. So we said, help us, is the way that it's written in code now, does it make sense? Should they be planted closer together or further apart? So they gave us some really good recommendations. We were pretty close based on our current code, but we made some improvements that actually now requires more trees to be closer together when they're planted. Questions on that?
Manny?
I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
Thank you, Chair. Was there public comment or anything received on this particular matter?
No.
Okay. I believe we do have someone from the school district that might want to speak to this. Is that correct?
Yeah, Kyle, would you like to come up?
Not on this specific, on this entire agenda item more.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
sorry.
No problem. Okay. I apologize.
Okay, any other questions on this one? Okay. All right, and then specific to fencing, this is another area where our code's very confusing. We have fencing standards if you're residential, different standards if you're industrial. Obviously, you have different needs. Industrial, you're trying to generally hide some outdoor storage, so we allow you to go taller. We also have allowances where you can do barbed wire on certain types of fencing, depending on where it's at. So we cleaned it up, put all the fencing standards in one section, so you don't have to look through multiple sections of our zoning code. We basically just condensed it and tried to make it so it made more sense. One of the things that came out of the state legislature this year was that battery charged or electric fencing now has to be allowed. Seems like an odd thing to add, but we literally copied and pasted the language from state law and put it into our zoning code. Questions on any of that?
Please, go ahead.
Just on the electric fencing, was there a rationale provided by the state? I assume there was some prescriptive goal they wanted to achieve by doing that. So I guess I just wanted maybe some more context on, why that was added in the way it was.
I think there were probably some good fencing lobbyists that their clients wanted electric fencing, and a lot of jurisdictions did not allow it. We, in the past couple years, have seen probably less than 6 projects come forward that wanted to do electric fencing. And we generally are able to work with them. The big issue is how do you do electric fencing in a manner that doesn't shock the general public as they're walking by? So we do have regulations, again, through state law, they adopted regulations. So if somebody's walking by, they can touch the fence, it's not electric. The electric shock is actually on the inside of the fence. So there's a distance so that the average, small kid couldn't walk through and put his hand through and get shocked. And there's also regulations on the voltage. So you're not gonna hurt anyone with the maximum voltage, but again, having those regulations that state law is now required gives us the ability to allow more electric fencing.
Please, go ahead.
So, just so I'm clear, this is the electric fencing, not like the dog collar electric fencing, right?
No, this is a fence that's electrified so that anyone that is trying to break into a site, and they would normally jump a fence. So let's say you have an auto repair shop, so you have a lot of cars that are stored outside.
Oh, okay.
Maybe they want to have electric fencing, in the evening. And so if somebody was going to break into their site with normal fencing, they would just jump the fence and, break into the establishment.
Oh, okay. I was thinking the invisible fences that they use for dogs, but no, this is actually electric.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay, and then we have a lot of standards that are specific to different types of zoning districts. So within the residential zoning districts, again, that's more of our single-family zoning districts, we had some inconsistencies. We kind of talked about this before related to driveways. So we have minimum length and width of residential driveways that conflicted with the Public Works Design Manual. We just updated our standards to match that. And then we also had requirements for spacing between residential driveways. You might drive through an older neighborhood and see oh wow, they expanded their driveway to be enough for 4 cars, and it's right next to their neighbor's driveway. We have regulations that kind of limit how wide your driveway can be. You're not supposed to have your whole front yard be a driveway. We just made sure that we clarified those and made sure they match the Public Works Design Manual. And then when it came to infill lots, so we have some language in our code that if you are developing in an infill area, and let's say you're like in the Newlands, for instance, so it's kind of an older area with a lot of character, we have some requirements. You have to meet your adjacent neighbors' setbacks. So if you're building a new house, or maybe you're adding on to your house, your front setback has to be the same as your neighbor. You can't basically encroach in front of that. We've gotten a lot of complaints over the years on that section of code, and so we added some flexibility to say, like, you can either match your neighbor's front setbacks or whatever the setback requirement is in that specific zoning district, you can meet that. So again, allowing a little bit more flexibility for these infill projects that are trying to kind of, use some of these existing neighborhoods or add more density, gives them more flexibility. Questions on any of that? Okay. And again, just in that same residential district, we have some sections of our zoning code that talk about if you are new development coming in and you're in an infill area, we have setbacks between your side property line and your new building. And we wanted to make sure that you aren't negatively impacting maybe that single family house that's next door. So if you have a house next door that's single family and you're coming in with a 3-story apartment project, for instance, what can we do to better protect, and keep the character of that single family kind of neighborhood? And so we've added some language that if you are within 24 feet in height, that's your average 2-story house, you just match whatever your side setback is. So if your zoning code or your zoning district says your side setback needs to be 10 feet, great, then the first 24 feet of your building needs to be 10 feet from the property line. If you go taller than that, so anything taller than 24 feet, for every foot of height, you have to move a foot back. We call that a step back. And again, the intent here is to still allow for infill development, but protect the neighbor next door. We had a lot of discussion with the technical advisory committee on this, and they all really expressed a lot of concerns with just our current code with infill development. We have so many regulations that really kind of make infill difficult. Our parking makes it difficult, parking requirements, landscaping requirements make it difficult, our setback requirements make it difficult. So they said, are there things we can do that still protect the guy next door that's already there, but allow some of these smaller infill projects? And so this was something that we kind of all met on the middle on, that everybody was comfortable with. Questions just on that topic?
Good.
This is if it's near a multifamily built adjacent to a single family.
Yeah, and so we specify that this is applicable if you are in certain zoning districts. So any of our single-family zoning districts, this would apply. Also in our, what we call our MF14 multifamily 14 units per acre, this would apply. So it's not like citywide, it only applies if you're within certain zoning districts.
Okay, so say for example, I have a single family home and I am in a, MF14. And someone is going to build this, what would this mean exactly for that development that's next to me?
Yep, so the new developer coming in, he could build up to 2 stories, 24 feet in height, and just match the normal side setback.
Okay.
If he wanted to go taller than 2 stories, so that 3rd story, he would have to push the 3rd story back every foot taller over 24 feet. So let's say that 3rd story was 10 feet tall. He would need to push that 3rd story back 10 feet.
Okay, and how does this change from what it is now? Because that seems
That's a great question. Yeah, we have, I think, 4 different requirements in our code now for how to deal with step backs and setbacks. As staff, they conflict. We've actually administratively said this doesn't even make sense. I don't know what to do with this. So this cleans it up and comes up with one set of standards.
Okay, so in the example we just discussed with a single family, we have the development, and they want to build more than 2 stories. What's current practice right now in MF14?
Because there's so many what ifs,
really? Okay.
I would even say that, give me an example of what the zoning district is and how tall the building is. We have some sections of our code that say the entire building has to be pushed back, not just that 3rd floor has to be pushed back.
Okay.
We
so
have
like
sections.
like a slant, like you have the building, the building's not pushed back, but you can actually have like that slant. I think I've seen a couple developments come through here where they have the slant and then they kind of build.
Not
No,
sure I'm
maybe
following
not.
that.
Okay. Well, like, kind of like, right, oh, no, never mind, because we have someone.
Maybe the roof line? Maybe you're
Yeah,
thinking of a
I
roof
think
line?
that's, yeah, but in any case, okay, so 2 floors, you don't have to worry about moving it. Anything above you do.
Yep.
Near single family.
Yep.
What if it's a multifamily near multifamily?
It doesn't matter what you're next door to. So regardless of what's next door to you, this is kind of a one-size-fits-all. So any new development coming into a single-family zoning district would have to follow this.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And again, typically in your single-family zoning districts, you're limited to 2 stories or 30 feet in height anyway, so you're not getting buildings that are 5 stories in height, because we limit that anyway. But in these infill areas in particular, these are the kind of the complaints we're getting from the community is, again, you know, you want to make it continue to look like more like a single-family neighborhood, because historically it has been. So what can we do to protect that 3rd story so it's not like looming into your neighbor's, you know, backyard?
Well, I know, for example, you said that varies, and we had a couple cases, maybe 1 or 2, where it was actually the single family was separated by a street or an alleyway or something like that, but it was still I think if I'm remembering correctly, they still had to take into account the setback.
Yeah, and so that's a good example if, depending on what what was across from the street, and again, from our perspective, we're like, why are we pushing the building back if there's a building across the street? You're not protecting that building across the street. So this only applies to your side setback. It wouldn't apply to your front setback.
Oh, okay, that's another, okay, so it only applies to the front.
And so typically your front
Or,
setback.
excuse me, it only applies to the side, not the front, or the
Yeah.
rear.
Yep, so
Okay.
the front, you're facing a street.
Yeah.
And so in our mind, it didn't make sense to say if you're facing a street and you're building a new building, do you have to push the 3rd floor back from the street? Who are we protecting by doing that? And we're really discouraging infill by doing that.
And what about the rear, because you may have a neighbor in your rear?
Did we add it to the rear as well? Yep, so we did add it to the rear as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and then also for infill, some of the other things we added related to parking. A great example, some of these infill, smaller sites, let's say you have, 10 units, maybe a smaller apartment project, you have to have parking. Currently in code, we allow you to have a certain percentage of those to be on the street. So let's say you have to have 10 parking spaces on your site. Currently, we allow you to have 15% on the street. So not everything has to be on your parcel. What we found is, again, 15% really doesn't do a whole lot. Or, I'm sorry, 35% was allowed to be on the street. 35% really doesn't add a whole lot. Our old code actually allowed you to have 50% of your parking spaces to be on the street. So if you're required to have 10, again, instead of having 3 now be on the street, you can have 5 be on the street. Now, the one caveat to this is you can only use street parking for the street directly in front of you. So if you can only fit, 2 cars in front of you because your parcel's narrow, that's all you get. You don't get to basically use, your neighbor's street parking. You're limited to just the width of your lot to where you can have that street parking. Again, this was something that was in our old code, and for whatever reason, I think as part of the code update, it just got missed that we took it out, and so we're bringing it back in. Questions on that?
I have a question, not on that. I want to go back really quickly before we get too far ahead. I forgot to ask with regard to this, to the step back. What is the current step back in today's code, and what is the proposed step back, given the explanation you gave us earlier?
So we had about 4 or 5 different standards for step backs in the current code, which was the
got
problem.
it.
Nobody could figure out, so what's the requirement? And what I can do, for our next meeting, I'm going to provide some more examples of current step backs and proposed step backs, so we can kind of walk through all those.
Okay, and what is the proposed number? Is it consistent, or do we also have?
So we're proposing one standard, basically. Instead of, 4 or 5 different options, you have one standard. Anything taller than 24 feet, you have to step that 3rd story back.
Okay, and what's the distance?
1 foot back for every 1 foot of height.
Okay, 1 foot back, got it. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that was, again, kind of specific to residential standards, and next is up is our mixed-use district. So these are things like all of our midtown area is mixed-use district, all of our downtown is mixed-use district. We have some language that we have in certain mixed-use districts. We have a minimum density that you have to meet, or floor area ratio you have to meet. Again, we're trying to encourage density in these downtown areas, which in theory is great. We have found that a lot of development isn't able to make those minimum densities because they have to provide landscaping and they have to provide parking. So they're running out of space to actually have to meet these other density or floor area ratio requirements. So we've provided an avenue if they're not able to meet those minimum requirements, they can go through a minor site plan review. Minor site plan review application does not go to Planning Commission, it's just a staff review. That does get publicly noticed, so anyone that wants to review it or have concerns with it, they do get public notice. That can be appealed, and that goes to City Council on appeal. We also have an area of town, we call it the Downtown Riverwalk District. We don't get a lot of development before Planning Commission because everything pretty much goes straight to a building permit in this district for the most part. We had kind of some areas that hidden Easter eggs. Well, what's the maximum height in Downtown Riverwalk? It was really hard to actually interpret and find, so we just clarified what the maximum height was in that downtown area. Again, not adding any new standards, just clarifying in case you can't find it, hidden in the middle of 650 pages. Here it is. And that was specific to mixed use. Next is specific to non-residential. So that's things like industrial commercial, mixed-use airport, so areas that are more of these kind of big commercial industrial areas. So we have had quite a bit of discussion on screening. With kind of coming out of COVID, we had a ton of new industrial development, especially in the North Valleys area. And we ran into a lot of conflicts when we have these industrial projects next to residential. Even if there's a big distance, like spacing separation between industrial development and residential, we still found that there was just conflicts, right? Because it's noisy. A lot of them are operating 24 hours a day, so you have big semi-trucks backing up and the beeping. We also had really bright lights in a lot of these industrial centers. So we said, what can we do to kind of better protect residential in dealing with these big industrial projects? So we went back and we said the loading docks are generally the most problematic area of these sites, and again, where we get the most complaints from the public. So we put in some requirements that you have to move the loading docks on your site, brand new site, so that you're not facing residential. So the intent is you would redesign your site so you either face the back of the property where there's no residential, or create it so internally to your site you have loading docks, or maybe you even face the front of the street, again with screening requirements. But the intent is to keep those loading docks so they're no longer facing residential. So we added some specific language on that. We also added some language that if you're not able to meet some of those requirements for how it's designed or how it's screened, you can still go through what we call that minor site plan review process. So you have an out for more flexibility if you can't make it work for whatever reason. And I will say, for the most part, it's not a one-size-fits-all. A lot of these sites, you think, oh, it's great for industrial, and residential is 400 feet away, no problem. And we're separated by a lot of terrain difference and elevation difference. And you know what? There's a railroad track separating us. So why would the neighbors complain when they're next door to a railroad track? This is going to be far less impactful. Not true. Again, based on what we have learned in the past couple years, there's things we could have done better to protect those neighbors with the lighting, with the screening, with the trees, with the way that the site was designed. So each of these kind of needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis if they're not able to meet the minimum screening requirements, and we're okay with that. It gives us the flexibility to add conditions of approval. So we were fine with just, again, adding more requirements, but also adding an avenue for them to go through that minor site plan review, which gets publicly noticed and can be appealed to City Council. General questions on that? Yep,
just one. You mentioned it like with noise, and I think in the batch of comments we received, there was maybe a request or feedback around maximum noise decibels or some noise standards. And was that incorporated in some form or another into these changes?
So we currently have regulations on noise if you're adjacent to residential zoning. The complaints or the comments you received are specific to downtown. We've had quite a few discussions with the residents living in downtown. If you're in downtown, we have zero noise regulations, zero noise ordinances for downtown. So within these, like this type of area, for something like this, if it's adjacent to residentially zoned property, they have to follow our noise regulations.
Okay, great. And I think the ones, this reminds me of the places up in the North Valleys.
Correct.
Okay, great.
Correct. One other thing I'm just, not necessarily here, but I just want to bring it up too, is the 24-hour use. We have now changed or proposed to change the requirements. If you're in some of these industrial zoning districts and you want to do a warehouse or distribution, you do not trigger a conditional use permit if you want to operate 24 hours a day. That has continued to be a concern and an area of contention, so we propose to change that. And what we're proposing now is it would trigger a conditional use permit if you're an industrial project wanting to operate 24 hours a day. So that would go to a planning commission for a public hearing.
Okay, great. Thanks, Angela.
Okay, lighting. Again, probably something you guys don't see very much because it's just part of the development process, but not something we typically have a lot of discussion on. So we currently regulate kind of 3 levels of lighting, 3 different types of things. The first one is lumens, and lumens is measuring kind of the brightness of the light. We also regulate kelvins, which is the heat of the light. Something that's really hot would be more of a yellow color. Something that is less hot would be more of a blue color. And then we also regulate foot candles, basically how much light comes off the light bulb and spreads off your site. So all of that is currently regulated. In our old code, we only regulated foot candles. So again, within the last 3 years, we now regulate lumens, kelvins, and foot candles. We have found that we don't necessarily, that's not typical. Most jurisdictions just regulate one of those things, not all 3 things. And we have found that it's kind of been problematic just from an administration point of view. Lumens is actually really hard for us to enforce. A lot of times you go through a building permit and they have to submit a plan that shows the kelvins and the lumens and the foot candles, and that's great. And then they build the building, and then we get complaints on lighting. And people say, God, it's way too light. We're like, no, it shows on the building permit that the lights are supposed to be this level. And we're like, there's no way, looking at that site, that those lights are actually meeting that level. So over time, people changed out light bulbs, and it just became problematic. So we're finding that we should probably remove lumens because we don't really have the ability or the tools to enforce what the lumens are. From a code enforcement perspective, we don't have the tools. They tell us what the lumens are, but that's not really an enforcement thing. We need the ability to measure it. So we're proposing to remove regulating lumens. Again, that's not something we ever regulated. Most jurisdictions don't regulate lumens, but we're still proposing to keep the kelvins, so the heat, and proposing to keep the foot candles, which is the big one. Most jurisdictions just regulate foot candles. We also looked at, from a residential perspective, if you have a use that's next to residence or residential zoning, we have requirements that your poles can't be taller than 18 feet. A lot of these commercial or industrial sites, they're 20 feet tall or 40 feet tall if they're on the building, like that bottom picture. So anytime we have a building or a development now that comes in that is next to residential zoning, we cap you at 18 feet for your lights. Any questions on that?
Sure. I have one. How do we strike the balance between removing the regulation of lumens and the public feedback we received last meeting where folks were concerned about light pollution? Like, I understand lighting the parking lot, but not necessarily lighting the sky.
Dark sky?
Correct.
So we did not change our dark sky requirements. That is still in code. We didn't touch that. And that was more of, you have to shield the lights, so that's still required. They have to be shielded, and they have to be pointed downward. We didn't touch that. That's still in code. Again, from a perspective of what we're regulating, we still look at how bright those lights are going to be based on. Those pictures are a great example. The bigger issue we see is how much light pollution is coming off those lights onto the neighboring properties. So we still regulate that with the foot candles.
Okay. Thanks, Angela.
Okay, we're getting close, everyone. Generally speaking, again, residential adjacency, we had two different sections of our code that says this is the threshold for what triggers additional standards for what we call a residential adjacency. One requirement is if you're a commercial use or a non-residential use, and you're within 150 feet of residential zoning. We had another section of code that said it's triggered if you're within 300 feet of residential zoning. So because we had two kind of conflicting regulations, we said, well, that doesn't make sense. Let's just have one set of standards. So we went with the one that protects the residents more. We said you would trigger residential adjacency, which is more standards, more protection for anyone within 300 feet of residential zoning. So it's already in code. We're not adding a new regulation. It's already in code. We're just getting rid of two conflicting regulations of, is it 150 or is it 300? And then we had some, again, more clarification on what is exempt from residential adjacency. So you're exempt if you are a certain distance, maybe separated by a freeway or a railroad track, or if you're a certain height or if you're a certain square footage. It became very confusing to administer, so we cleaned that up. We didn't add any new standards or remove any standards. We just cleaned it up to make it make more sense to the average person and to us as planners. And then specific to signs, we have some language if you are a sign and you're dealing with residential development within 300 feet. So there's a certain requirement for how much illumination those signs can have. We cleaned it up. Again, it didn't really make sense from an administration point of view. Didn't want to add or take away any regulations, just cleaned it up so it made more sense. And then again, we kind of talked about this before with the exterior lighting. We limit you to 18 feet. If you are within so many feet, the light pole is limited to 18 feet in height if you are within 300 feet of residential zoning. Okay, and housing. So this is a very small section of our code. It has more to do with affordable housing. We didn't make any changes with the code update. We are doing a very separate text amendment on housing that's at council and now going through some additional stakeholder feedback. So not changing much specific to housing within the code update, but definitely proposing some changes within the affordable housing text amendment that you guys reviewed. And finally, skyways. So we don't get skyways very often. I think we've had one skyway in 20 years. And so when this section of code was written, it was written 20 years ago. We had very different technology back then. Now we have like digital cameras, which is amazing the things you can do. And you can Photoshop. So our code required that you submit like 35 millimeter film, which I don't think that's even a thing anymore. It also code required that you submit like a giant 24-inch by 36-inch board. Can you imagine? It seems so funny now that we used to do that, but you used to have to submit giant poster boards of what your skywalk or your skyway was going to look like. So we said, that's silly. Please don't submit 35 millimeter. We don't know what to do with it. So we just removed that language and said, you still have to submit renderings, but do it in a normal digital fashion. So again, no substance changes, just clarifying that we don't need the old stuff anymore. We need the new stuff. Questions on that?
Is that the university?
It is.
Turned out nice.
Yeah. Okay, and so that is everything. Is there any other feedback we wanted to go over?
Well, what we can do too is just quick disclosures, and I do have one public comment,
Okay.
and then we can run it back on you. Commissioner Villanueva, any disclosures?
No disclosures.
Commissioner Armstrong, no disclosures.
Commissioner Becerra reviewed public comments, emails, staff briefing. That's it.
You know what? I realized I did get a email from Washoe
ahead.
County.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Okay. Commissioner Munoz,
Commissioner Munoz read an email.
Commissioner Draculich read and received emails and spoke to a stakeholder from Washoe County School District. All right, with that said, we will do public comment. I do have one request to speak form from the kind gentleman waiting. Kyle Chisholm, you have 3 minutes. Go ahead and state your name for the record. I think you know the drill.
Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. Kyle Chisholm, representing Washoe County School District. And I just realized today that what our comment is related to is a little off topic from what was focused on tonight. I think Angela covered Chapter 4. Our comment is specific to Chapter 3. I think we missed that in the March meeting. I know that was briefly discussed, but we did want to make our voice heard and get our comment in on related to that. It is all one text amendment, so to speak, just broken up. So first of all, I just want to state for the record that the school district is opposed to Code Section 1803, 303, B3E, and B4A5 as proposed in the staff report. As many of you are aware, the school district has recently adopted a facilities modernization plan, which is a 15-year strategic plan, upward of $2.2 billion invested into the community to revitalize our existing schools. Many of these investments will be designed and budgeted years in advance of building permit. And so our concern with the code language as written is that there is potential for last minute type of requests or design changes that could come as a result of that. Now, I know that the current staff's intent isn't for that. And as a matter of fact, in the last meeting, it was stated that this was more intended to address charter school issues, but this definitely encompasses, this language definitely encompasses the school district as well. And we see the generally vague nature of the language to cause confusion, especially with our design professionals that we spend hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars over in the next 15 years. So we want to have language that is very clear and precise. And I think, you know, relevant to tonight, Angela just hit all the development standards in Chapter 4, and we believe that those specific standards that's where they should live, and not have a somewhat discretionary or possibly opinionated take on what the requirement could or should be. And so that's really the concern with us. And respectfully, we request that the Planning Commission consider voicing concern on this as well to the council. I know that you can't directly make changes to this text amendment, but it is definitely going to negatively impact the school district in the long run and with our plans. So appreciate your time and consideration. Here for any questions.
Thank you. Heather, do we have anybody on Zoom or any voicemails?
We did not receive any voicemails for this item. For the record, we did receive correspondence, which was forwarded to the Planning Commission and has been entered into the record. And it does not look like we have any hands raised on Zoom.
Thank you. Anybody in the chambers wishing to speak on this item? Seeing none, we'll close public comment. Go to the commissioners for wrap-up conversation, questions. Commissioner Villanueva, go ahead.
So I don't know that I can ask the public commenter questions, so I'll ask Angela questions. If you can, you probably understand where he's coming from. Can you touch on that? So I see the provisions, but he said it was ambiguous and vague and discretionary. Can you just explain what maybe the concern is?
Yeah, and Kyle, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think the concern was we proposed to add some language that basically said before we approve a building permit, we have flexibility to look at school sites in terms of where crosswalks are going to go, where queuing for drop-off and pickup is going to go. So it's a catch-all for all types of schools, whether it's a charter school or Washoe County School District. The challenge we have had in the last, well, really since WC1 passed and COVID, since we've started seeing schools come in, is oftentimes schools are built and we haven't, as a city, done maybe the review and the diligence to really address some of the pedestrian safety concerns. And so the schools get built, and then after the fact, we go in and ask the school district, oh, we need to put a crosswalk in here because we didn't look at it, and maybe at the same degree now that we would look at. So in my mind, that section of code has been added so that we have the ability, again, before we approve a building permit, because not everything goes through a discretionary review, it clarifies that we can look at it and look at kid drop-off and pickup and where buses are coming and going, where crosswalks are going to be, where the school, flashers have to go. That language is broad enough that it gives us the ability to look at all of those things before we approve a building permit.
And what are they wanting? They're wanting specifics, or
I will let Mr.
is that
Chisholm answer
okay?
that.
I don't,
Yeah.
it's, okay.
No,
I guess
you're
the
fine.
chair
And
can
I think we're
determine.
okay with that. Yeah, and we had a short conversation about it at the last meeting. And yeah, I mean, I guess we'll let Kyle clear it up a little bit because I think our conversation wasn't where it is right now is just all of a sudden we're going to be changing designs that took years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to make and, slow down potential investment into the school district. But we'll let Kyle go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you, Kyle Chisholm, Washington County School District, for the record. So I guess to answer that question, the nature of the language right now basically says that the administrator can control pretty much all aspects related to our site design with regards to driveways, circulation patterns, queuing, crosswalk, traffic safety flashers, parking. As we just saw, there's already a ton of development standards for all of these things. That's why we have development standards. And so our concern is that what could possibly come up with this language? It could be anything. Not to get into a bunch of back history, but there has been times where, this district has got all the way through a process and had to go back and make significant site improvements that really affected our budget and our process way after the fact. And so that is what we foresee as possibly happening here. And really, we want to put the design on our professionals and our design teams and not have ambiguous standards that aren't clear.
So you're saying if you guys follow the development code as written, you don't want the potential to come in front of staff and they say, well, we need this, this additional thing, and this other thing. Is that essentially what
I
you're
mean, in addition to not wanting to do that, we're already going to have to do that through additional discretionary reviews. Every school that is a new school or a major redesign is going to have to come through some sort of approval process before either staff or this commission, possibly even council, depending on what it is. And that's due to the nature of where our parcels are located. They're surrounded by residential. You just saw the residential adjacency standards that we have to comply with. But so we are going to have to go through a discretionary approval, but in our view, that would be the appropriate place to say, okay, you need a flasher on this street, and here's why, and it's justified in a staff report, not 10 seconds before a building permit. That's our concern.
And for point of a clarification too, the process you go through, because you are the school district, which is obviously, I guess, very new to us, because usually we're dealing with private developers. How much different is that? And, time consuming, cost consuming, because we really are talking about the school district's money, which is tax-paying citizens.
Yes, absolutely. All taxpayer funded. And I would say that the process is no different than a private development. And which is why, I question why this very focused, kind of somewhat targeted code section. What about drive-through restaurants? What about, mega warehouses and the issues that they've brought, and why is this level of discretion being put on schools specifically and not every other type of development?
Commissioner Becerra, please.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. I do understand where staff is coming from with the safety of children and being dropped off and make sure everything's fine. I also understand, I think, where the school district's coming from and not wanting undue burden. I think the really neat thing about where we're at right now in the process, according to Angela in the little diagram she showed us, is that we're still in the early stages with collecting feedback. And so perhaps, Angela, would you and your team be amenable to talking with the school district and finding some common ground and clarifying language? And I'm sure knowing the way you work and your team, it's not, you're not out to get anyone.
No, and I think the reason for this is because not every school triggers discretionary review. We have a lot of zoning districts that you can build a school permitted by right. All of our commercial, all of our mixed use, professional office, all of those, our schools are permitted by right. So we consistently have challenges with new schools coming in. And we put some language in the code that just puts them on alert. I don't care if you're a charter school or a private school or a public school. We need to see a queuing plan. We need to see how you're going to handle drop off and pick up. If you have 1,500 kids coming to school and being dropped off every day, that's not a drive-through. I mean, that is a major, major impact. We have to deal with, kids biking and walking in conflicts with other, neighborhoods. And so schools are a unique use, and this was written into code because we, time and time again, have missed this and screwed it up, and schools get built, and we get complaints immediately that we didn't address these issues. So knowing that pretty much every school that's built, we need to look at these issues, we put it into code to say, heads up, these are the things we're gonna look for. We're not telling you what the requirement is, we're just saying, as a courtesy, charter school or public school or private school, these are the things we want to see before we approve a building permit.
So sorry.
Please go ahead.
So is there any, because I think you make very valid points, absolutely, everything you said. I also see their perspective. Is there any way we can give a little bit more detail as to what you guys are going to be looking for, so that, because I mean, if it's true that, they're right just about to, go online, and then all of a sudden you have to make these changes, which could cost a lot of, tons of money, which it is taxpayer dollars. Is there anything additional? I mean, I think what you guys do just need to have a conversation, but because you both make really strong points.
Yeah.
So.
And I will say this is something, just as a heads up, council is very, very strong on this. So they will likely add 10 times more strength than what I'm adding in the code right now. School district is probably aware of that, but the language we added was very broad. It doesn't mandate anything, it doesn't require anything. It just says, heads up, these are the things we're concerned with, that when you come in for a building permit, we're gonna wanna see. That's all that says.
I think just tightening the feedback loop, I think it's more how we work, right? The language is the language, and I think they're good, guiding principles. And again, I think maybe a conversation where it's just how we work, and the school district in this case, as the stakeholder, knows we're not going to tell you about these guiding principles at the end. You're going to know up front, so you know what to plan for, right? And hopefully, when it does happen, it's the exception and not the rule, right?
And, anything that triggers a discretionary review, and we get these as well, whether it's a minor conditional use permit, doesn't go to planning commission, something that staff reviews, we look at all those things at the time of that review. So whenever that school comes in, whether it's at a discretionary review or a building permit, we are looking at the same things. But because a lot of the schools are in zoning districts that have no discretionary review, they only come in for a building permit, we're just giving you a heads up as whatever school you are. Please know that we're going to want to see this as part of a traffic study and a queuing study, and how are parents going to park when they're trying to get in and out. But to me, this is more of a common sense thing, that we're just putting schools on alert, because we've had so many of the charter schools come in as well. I mean, post-COVID, we have a ton of charter schools coming into existing shopping centers, right, where they're not designed for schools. And now we are kind of pushing back, saying maybe this isn't the appropriate site for these reasons, because we've had so many schools that have had challenges with the drop-off and pickup and the conflicts, we as staff are like, "Oh, let's catch this before you spend the time and the money and build it." And then we come back after the fact, and Kyle knows, like, I can't tell you how many times we've gone back after the school's built and said, this isn't working. We need crosswalks at a different location because we didn't, analyze it to the degree that we should have. So in my mind, I'm like, we are actually saving the school districts or the private schools money by catching it up front. And they are welcome to come talk to us at any time, right? If you're at the 30% level and want to talk to us about traffic, come in then. There's no limitation on that. But we're just saying, hey, every school that's coming in, know that these are concerns that we're going to look at before we're going to give you a building permit.
Commissioner Armstrong, good.
Thanks. So I guess what I'm hearing is that it's sort of a timing issue. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Chisholm, but it sounds like because of like how long out the plans are being made, the concern is like, oh, well, we designed this like 10 years ago for the sake of arguing, and now we have this issue. So in terms of feedback and understanding that city council, has a particular view and may want to tighten this up anyway, from where I sit, maybe it's just like, can we get some guidance on timing, or like, I understand that it's a heads up, but like at what point maybe some of these things have to be dialed in or like not subject to change, because then maybe that adds clarity and it makes it more navigable. So it's like not a surprise and it's less discretionary.
Yeah, and we could add something in the code that says, anytime you're building a school, come in and talk to us at any time in the review process, so we can have that feedback. Again, that's not something we should have in the code. That's common sense, right? We've been working with the school district. We have a good relationship with them. Again, as schools have been built, the same challenges are popping up over and over again. So we're learning. It only took us a few schools to figure it out, but we are learning. Let's catch these things, because every school we've had to, pretty much go back and say, whoops, we did that one wrong. Let's catch that next time around.
One last question on this. When you say we built schools, are we talking about like new schools or new buildings, or new schools that pop up in a shopping center?
Any new school that is built, or any new school that goes into a shopping center, any new school that comes into an existing location.
Sorry, okay, let me clarify. When you talk about, oops, we messed up, is that for new schools that were buildings from the school district or charter schools, that were in a shopping center?
It's all schools. I mean, I can name a school and I can tell you that's opened in the last 5 years, and I could probably tell you what we missed and we should have caught.
Actually, that would be perfect. Like,
Have you seen the news lately? I mean,
No, I know.
let me just Google it, and I'm sure we'll find something on Facebook.
Just since we try to, or we do aim to ask for supporting documentation from applicants and so forth, would it make sense to provide supporting data to council?
To justify
and
why we
us
need
to
to
say,
add
hey,
this? Yeah,
in the last
absolutely.
12 months, these are the oops that we should have caught if we had these in place. And that would also provide context to Mr. Chisholm and others, and then find that common ground.
Sure, yep.
Commissioner Munoz, did you want to chime in? Didn't want to forget about you, buddy.
No, you're all good. The discussion's perfect. So I appreciate it, guys.
Okay.
Chair, I have one more question, but
Please.
it's not about the school district, so I'll let you guys finish that conversation and then touch on something else.
I think we're kind of good, and we'll wrap it up. I will give Kyle one more chance. If you want to put anything on public record, you have your go now. Closing argument.
Yeah, just to follow up to Commissioner Armstrong's question about the timing, I think it's both a timing issue, and that's definitely a major concern because, but also the fact that staff or the administrator can change at a moment's notice. The decision, so we could go in, for example, today and have a whole plan cleared by Angela, and not saying it's going to happen, but a month from now, there's a new administrator or somebody else's, and so that changes. This happens, it happens all the time where people's opinions change. We get conflicting answers on different things. And so that would be the other major concern with this. The other thing is that there's standards for this stuff. There's, you know, the municipal uniform traffic control manual that talks about all the school flasher stuff. There's the traffic study that we're going to provide pretty much on every large project we do. That's prepared by a qualified traffic engineer. So I mean, it's just, there's no, it's really just the ambiguity of this language is what it comes down to.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thank you, guys.
All right, we'll move on from that. The message will be sent to commission or council, I'm sure. And thank you, both of you, for clarifying. Commissioner Villanueva, do you have a question outside of that scope?
Yes, for Angela, we touched on it early, but I don't know that we got into the specifics of this particular item. So for single-family residential, I see that there have been, looks like it's section, maybe it is multifamily residential. Section 1802-208, but I see it in a couple other sections. In any case, it looks like, going back to the setbacks, it's going from 10 feet on the side to 5 feet. Is that section 18.02 looks like 208. And there's a couple different areas. That's where it starts.
Are you talking about in some of the multifamily zoning districts?
Yeah, I know we talked about it briefly earlier. I just want some clarity. So in the setbacks, the graphic with the setbacks, it's line item line item D, side, and then it says 5 foot, which I guess currently it's 10 foot.
So for instance, I'm just gonna reference a multifamily zoning district. I'm just looking at it here.
Okay.
So the side setback is currently 5 feet. That's 5 feet for the main building and 5 feet if there's an accessory building like a shed. The line that I think you're looking at is specific to if you have projects with 2 or more units, and the side yard is adjacent to a single-family zoning district.
What does that mean?
That was our question too. Like, that is a weird
So you
Easter
just
egg.
got
I
rid
don't
of it.
even know
You
what that means. So, I mean, we were like, that
Okay.
doesn't even make sense to us. So
Okay.
we deleted that kind of thing that just didn't make sense as to why that was even a code requirement. So basically, you have to be in a certain zoning district, and you have to have more than 2 buildings, and you have to be adjacent to single-family zoning. Then your setback is an additional 5 feet. Instead of 5 feet, it's 10 feet. So from staff's perspective, it just became difficult to administer something that was so weird and unique, and we said, well, that doesn't make sense, let's just take that out.
Okay, so you just took them out. Okay, that was my only question. Thank you.
Oh, you got one more. Commissioner Becerra, go ahead.
Sure. I think we're at the end, right?
Yep.
More or less.
We're there.
Okay. So given that, thank you so much. You and your team are doing a great job. And I was just curious, how can the general public continue to provide feedback and have that feedback incorporated into proposed changes as we move along this process?
So, I mean, there's a couple things. We still have, one more planning commission meeting where I'll be getting feedback, and then I'm going to take that information so they can participate in that. They can participate in the city council hearing. Well, all we're going to do is talk about feedback. They're not making any decisions. And then I'll be coming back again to planning commission so we can provide more public input. And then I'm going to go back to planning commission again with a red line document for you guys to move forward with. So from just even talking about feedback, there's at least probably 3 more public meetings. We also have a website on our city website specific to the zoning code. So if they want to look at the red line changes, they can look at it. There's a box where they can check, where they can provide public comment through that forum as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Angela. And do we have a target date? Are we aiming for July 1 or some time?
2026 would be my target date.
Okay.
I'm kidding.
You kid. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Chair.
No, the target date is continuing to move. I think depending on council's feedback on what changes they want, I'm guessing we'll probably have a handful of council meetings before we get to a red line document that they're ready to move forward with. Just a guess.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Commissioner Munoz, you get the last word, friend.
So I was just going through the notes I wrote down, and one thing that I did have, I just wanted to kind of bring up real quick, just for clarification for everybody. One of the companies that I work for recently installed an electric fence. The fence, mostly what the purpose of it is, if anybody touches it, it sets off an alarm and lights. It also has a very small amperage of shock. I think it's 7,000 watts or something. Not enough to kill, not enough to knock you down or nothing like that, but enough to say, don't touch this ever again. It's not a good feeling. So other than that, this is a great, I really appreciate all the work you're putting into this, Angela, and all the work the staff's doing. I know it's a lot, and I can't imagine sitting down and going through all this stuff like you guys are. So I really do appreciate it. And believe it or not, I'm actually looking forward to the next one.
Great. He must be drinking right now.
Awesome. Thank you, ladies, all of you, for the hard work. We appreciate it. We'll close item 5 because we don't need to make any motion or anything. We're just
Yeah,
we're
again, just feedback.
conversating.
And
Love it.
as things come up, feel free to, reach out. We'll have another meeting where we're going to go through the final sections of code, and then we will have more feedback. Hey, did we miss anything? Like I said, I'll put all of our presentations into one presentation so we can go back and look at any slides from our last meeting or this meeting or the next meeting. We will provide more clarification on the step back topic so we can show what's in code now versus what we're proposing, just in case there's additional feedback on changes to that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you as well. All right. We'll close item 5. Item 6. Mike, you touched your green button. Go.
We are going to postpone item 6 tonight, and I'll discuss that more under item 8.
Perfect.
We'll move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Close item 6. Item 7, Truckee Meadows Regional Planning Liaison Report. Who's my guy?
I'm the alternate, but both are gone. The recent meeting was actually canceled for end of March. The next meeting is in April, or this month, later in the month.
Perfect. Great. Closing item 7. Moving to item 8, staff announcements.
We'll kind of bundle items 8.1, 8.2, and 8.3 into one. The commission has expressed some interest in having training sessions or having some presentations done by staff, but there's been not much in the way of direction of what you would like to see. In fact, the training that we had originally talked about tonight was essentially so generic in nature, I think it probably wasn't really beneficial. So if you have ideas, I would encourage you to share those with me, and then I can work with staff to bring something back. If you have ideas tonight, feel free to share them. If not, you can email them or send them through Michelle or Heather, however you prefer. But we would like to put something together that we think is meaningful for the staff or for the commission of areas that they would like some education on.
Sure.
Go ahead, Commissioner Becerra.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Mike. I don't know, just something that comes to mind for me is like how we work, how our work impacts regional. Having sat on those, it's still sometimes a little unclear. I can deduce how our work impacts, but maybe having just a training or a discussion on the full life cycle of our work from local, like Reno or Sparks, if we were in Sparks, then to regional and so forth, like a full big picture overview of our work.
Do that.
Commissioner Armstrong.
Yeah, I think building off that, so the title, I guess, for the presentation was Overview of Planning Commission Roles and Responsibilities. So earlier this year, you had put together, I think it was just like a single slide that basically was like, hey, here's the majority of the types of projects this body looks at in a given year, for example, in 2023. And those include, kind of a handful of things like conditional use permits, site plan reviews, things like that. So I think for like a new commissioner's perspective, it would be really helpful to maybe just have like an overview of, hey, these are the things you're most likely going to see. And here's a little refresher on what this piece of it is, like a major site plan review, for example, and what findings we want you to make and like what the rationale for that is. So just kind of like high level, but a little more precise, so it's not super general.
Absolutely. Any others?
All right. Do you have any more on item 8?
Under item 8.4, just a quick update on council actions. Council did not take action on the housing amendments that were presented previously, so they've requested that staff go back and hold additional workshops, gather more public input, and then we'll keep you posted as that comes forward.
How was our meeting received by them?
I think that part of the reason that was, I think maybe, quite frankly, caught a little bit off guard. So maybe to essentially give them some time to digest that and gather some additional input regarding those changes.
I kind of expected that.
Also, as I mentioned previously at the last meeting, the Reno Axe project was appealed to the city council. Council did uphold the approval of the conditional use permit for Reno Axe. And then at their next meeting, the 2 Plum Lane zone changes that you heard 2 meetings ago, as well as the White Lake Commerce Center specific plan district that was at your last meeting, those will be held, the hearings will be held on April 10th at the council for those projects. That's it.
Thank you, Ms. Rayleigh. Appreciate it. Oh, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I will say staff did advise us that it would cause more work for them, and sure enough, it did.
You're welcome, ladies. All right, closing item 8, moving to item 9, commissioner suggestions for future agenda items.
I think I mentioned one last time, and Nate was covering for you, Mike, and he was going to follow up with me, and I'm not sure if that got passed along, but happy to work with you on that if need be.
Closing item 9, moving to item 10, public comment. This item is for either public comment on any action item or for any general public comment. Heather, any goods over there?
I have no request to speak, forms, voicemails, or correspondence has been received for this item.
All right, anybody in the chambers wish to speak on general public comment? All right, seeing none, we'll close item number 10, public comment. Move to item 11, adjournment.
So moved.
All right, sounds good, y'all. Have a good night. Thanks.
Good night.
Just wanted to share something as well on the school issue. So the school district recently appealed a case of a new private school going in. It's like, these are the types of reasons why we just want to clarify on the record. You need to show a queuing plan, you need to show crosswalks. The school district is appealing the private school because they don't feel that we reviewed their project to the degree that they feel we should have reviewed it. Schools are a little contentious in this community.
Yeah, and honestly, I think it is, you make such a valid choice because some of the church schools just pop up
Yeah.
all over the place.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I get